The night Elijah Shelby first heard Marcella Lockhart sing, he had been riding for 11 straight hours through the red dust of the Texas Panhandle, and the sound stopped him so completely that his horse, a steady roan named Copper, simply halted of his own accord, as though the animal too understood that something rare was happening just beyond the tree line. It was the autumn of 1873, and the land around Cutter's Creek, Texas, had turned the color of old rust and pale straw. The summer had been punishing, the kind that dried creek beds to cracked mud and turned the grassland into a brittle sea of amber. But the nights had grown cool enough to breathe properly, and the stars over the Panhandle hung so low and thick they looked like someone had flung a handful of crushed glass across a bolt of black velvet. Elijah had been working cattle drives since he was 19 years old, and he was 28 now, which meant he had slept under those stars more nights than he had slept under a roof. He knew the sounds of the open range as well as he knew the lines of his own hands. He knew coyotes and mockingbirds and the low, distant rumble of a herd settling for the night. He knew wind through mesquite and the creak of saddle leather and the particular silence that came just before a storm. He did not know this. The voice drifted through the wall of a small cabin set back from the dirt road that wound toward the town of Cutter's Creek. The cabin was modest, built from rough-hewn timber, with a covered porch running along the front and a single window on the left side where a faint amber light glowed behind oilcloth. There was a vegetable garden along the south wall, nearly finished for the season, and a small corral to the east with 2 spotted goats and what looked like an old mule. It was a homesteader's place, the kind of place that spoke of hard work and harder circumstances, and at this hour, well past 9 in the evening, it should have been dark and quiet. But Marcella Lockhart was singing. She was singing something low and sweet and almost painfully gentle, the kind of melody that had no sharp edges, only curves. It was not a hymn exactly, though it had the quality of prayer. It moved like water over smooth stone, unhurried and certain of its direction. Elijah could not make out all the words through the timber wall, but he caught phrases. Something about a meadow and a bright silver river. Something about a child sleeping safe. Something about the stars knowing every name. He dismounted without thinking about it. He looped Copper's reins around the low branch of a cottonwood at the edge of the yard, and he stood there in the dark, listening. He felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, something that had nothing to do with want or hunger, or the ordinary loneliness of a man who spent most of his days in the company of cattle and trail dust. It was something quieter than that, something that felt almost like recognition, as though some part of him had always known a sound like this existed in the world, and had simply been waiting to find it. The song went on, and then there was a small voice, a child's voice, murmuring something, and Marcella's voice answered with a laugh so soft it barely traveled through the wall. And then the song began again, slightly different this time, gentler still. Elijah understood then that she was putting children to bed. He understood that he was a stranger standing in the dark outside a woman's home at nearly 10 o'clock at night, listening to something entirely private. He knew he should mount back up and ride the remaining 2 miles to the boarding house in town where he had a room waiting. He sat down on the edge of the porch steps instead. He did not entirely understand why. He only knew that the sound of her voice was the first thing in a long time that had made the world feel less like a place a man simply endured, and more like a place worth being in. He set his hat on his knee and leaned his back against the porch post, and he listened, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and somewhere out in the mesquite, a cricket sang its own simple song, and Elijah Shelby stayed. The song changed again around what he guessed was 10:30. It became even softer, barely a breath, and then it stopped entirely, and the light behind the oilcloth window dimmed and went dark. The cabin settled into the particular quiet of a house where children slept. Elijah still did not move. He sat with his hat in his hands and let the night air cool around him and thought about where he was going and where he had been, and whether those two things were actually connected the way a man wanted to believe they were. He was in Cutter's Creek, because he had been hired by a rancher named Holly's Bead to help manage a small cattle operation about 4 miles east of town. It was not glamorous work. Most ranching work was not. But Elijah was good at it. Good with animals and good at reading land and good at the kind of slow, patient attention that made the difference between a herd that thrived and a herd that scattered. He had come from San Antonio originally, and before that from a small farm in East Tennessee that no longer existed in any form he would recognize. His mother had died when he was 15, his father not long after from grief and bad whiskey, and Elijah had gone west the way a lot of young men with nothing holding them east went west, with nothing but a bedroll and the particular recklessness of someone who does not yet know what he has to lose. He had learned a great deal since then. He had learned that the land was not interested in sentiment. He had learned that weather and distance and the sheer physical difficulty of living in this country could reduce a man to his plainest self very quickly. He had learned that there were good people scattered across the prairie like seeds that had found unlikely purchase, people who were generous and decent, and who kept their word, and that there were also people who were none of those things, and that the ability to tell the difference quickly was its own kind of survival skill. He had not learned, yet, what to do with the fact that at 28 he had never let himself stay anywhere long enough to build something real. He was aware of the fact. He simply had not yet found a reason good enough to change it. He was still thinking about that when the porch light came on. He scrambled to his feet so fast his hat fell into the dirt, and he grabbed for it just as the cabin door swung open, and a woman stepped out with a cast-iron skillet held in her right hand and a lantern in her left, and she held both of them like she knew exactly how to use them. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair pulled back but falling loose in places from a long day's work, and her eyes in the lantern light were a deep warm brown that were currently sharp as flint. She wore a practical gray dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she looked at Elijah Shelby on her porch with an expression that was equal parts alarm and absolute iron-spined readiness. "I will absolutely use this," she said, lifting the skillet slightly. "I want to be very clear about that." "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said, and he took 2 steps back off the porch and held both hands out where she could see them, his hat dangling from the fingers of his right hand. "I am so sorry. I know how this looks. I am not here to cause you any trouble, I promise you that." She studied him with the kind of thorough assessment a person develops when they live alone and cannot afford to be wrong about people. She looked at his face and his hands and his horse at the cottonwood and the general bearing of a man who appeared embarrassed rather than threatening. "Then what are you here for?" she said. "Because it is nearly midnight and you are sitting on my porch without an invitation." Elijah opened his mouth and closed it again, because the truth, which was that her singing had stopped him cold, and he had simply not been able to leave, sounded ridiculous even inside his own head. He settled for a version of it. "I was riding past," he said, "and I heard you singing, and I am not able to explain it very well, but it made me stop. I sat down before I thought about what I was doing. I'm not a dangerous man, ma'am, I give you my word, but I understand completely if you want me to go, and I will go right now if that is what you want." A silence stretched between them, filled with cricket song and the distant complaint of one of her goats. "You heard me singing," she said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." "Through the wall?" "Yes, ma'am." She lowered the skillet slightly, not all the way, but enough to suggest she was reconsidering the immediate threat level. "That is the strangest thing anyone has said to me in a considerable while," she said. "I imagine so," he said. "Who are you?" she said. "Elijah Shelby," he said. "I am starting work at the Bead Ranch Monday. I have a room at the boarding house in town." "The Bead Ranch," she said, and something flickered in her expression, some piece of information filing itself away. "You have a long way left to ride." "I do," he agreed. "I should go." She looked at him for another long moment. And then, with the particular pragmatism of a woman who had long since learned to trust her instincts over propriety, she said, "My name is Marcella Lockhart. There is coffee on if you want a cup on the porch before you go, It is a cold ride to town, and I cannot in conscience send a man out into that without offering at least that much." Elijah blinked. "That is very kind of you. It is practical," she said briskly, "and I still have this skillet if you give me any reason to use it." He almost smiled. Understood completely. She left him on the porch and came back 2 minutes later with 2 tin mugs of coffee, and she sat in the porch chair while he sat on the top step, and they drank their coffee in the dark with the stars overhead and the goats quiet in their corral, and the cottonwood leaves shivering in the slight breeze. "How many children?" he asked after a while. "Two," she said. "Clara is 7 and Thomas is 4. "They are lucky," he said, "to have someone sing them to sleep like that." She was quiet for a moment, wrapping both hands around her mug. "Their father used to say the same thing," she said, and the way she said it told him without any further explanation that their father was gone. He did not push. He just nodded once and looked out at the dark yard. "He died in the spring," she said, though he had not asked. "Fever. It came fast. He was fine on a Tuesday and gone by the following Sunday." She said it plainly, the way people said things they had already had to say many times and had made a kind of peace with, even if the peace was thin in places. "His name was Robert. He was a good man." "I am sorry for your loss," Elijah said, and he meant it the full measure of the words. "We are managing," she said. She said it with a firmness that was clearly both a fact and a daily choice. "The children are healthy. The goats give enough milk. I have a garden and I can sew, and I do some washing for families in town. We are managing." "You are doing more than managing," he said quietly. "A woman alone with 2 children on a homestead in the middle of the Panhandle. That is not just managing, that is something considerable." She looked at him sideways, measuring whether the comment was flattery or genuine. She appeared to decide it was genuine, because some of the careful distance in her posture eased just slightly. "You are not quite what I expected when I came out here with my skillet," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone considerably more alarming." "I am sorry to disappoint you," he said, and that did make her laugh, a brief soft sound that matched the quality of what he had heard through the cabin wall, that same warmth and realness. He finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch railing and stood. "I should ride," he said. "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Lockhart. I am truly sorry for the fright." "No permanent harm done," she said. She rose too, picking up both mugs. "Mr. Shelby." "Ma'am." He walked to Copper and gathered the reins and swung up, and he looked back once. She was still standing at the edge of the porch, and the lantern light made a halo of the loose strands of her dark hair, and she was watching him go with an expression he could not quite read in the dark. He rode to town with the sound of her voice, still turning in his head like a wheel that had found its groove. The Bede Ranch was 4 miles east of town, a hardscrabble operation that ran about 300 head of longhorn cattle on grass that was not quite good enough and water that was not quite plentiful enough, but which Holly's Bede worked with the kind of grim persistence that had always defined life in this part of Texas. Holly's was a heavy-set man of 52, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a face that looked as though it had been left out in the weather for several decades, which it had. He had 2 ranch hands already, brothers named Pete and Clem Vargas, who were competent and quiet, and who showed Elijah the operation on Monday morning with the efficient manner of men who did not waste words. The work was hard and physical, and Elijah fell into it the way he always fell into ranch work, with the part of him that was most comfortable, the part that understood clear tasks and direct effort, and the honest, straightforward relationship between a man's labor and a visible result. He was up before dawn and working until dark 6 days a week, and on Sundays he rode to town for supplies or a meal at the boarding house or occasionally a seat at the back of the small Lutheran church, not because he was especially devout, but because he liked the music and the sense of community, and the reminder that the world contained more than cattle and fence lines. He told himself he was not thinking about Marcella Lockhart. He was, of course, thinking about Marcella Lockhart. He thought about her voice, and the way she had held that skillet with absolute serious intent, and the way she had offered coffee anyway, and the way she had said Robert was a good man with that thin, careful peace in her voice. He thought about Clara, who was 7, and Thomas, who was 4, sleeping in the cabin while their mother sang them safe. And he thought about the kind of courage that looked like ordinary daily life from the outside, but was anything but ordinary when you understood the actual dimensions of what it required. He did not go back to the Lockhart cabin. Not the first week, and not the second. What he did was go to the general store in Cutter's Creek on the Friday of his second week. An encounter, entirely by coincidence or the kind of arrangement the universe sometimes makes when two people are supposed to meet again. Marcella Lockhart at the dry goods counter with a small serious girl on one side of her, and a very small boy on the other who was attempting, without success, to climb the barrel of dried beans near the door. Elijah caught the boy before he toppled the barrel. He set the child down gently and held him upright by both small shoulders while Thomas blinked up at him with large brown eyes, and then immediately turned back toward the barrel with renewed determination. "Thomas," Marcella said, and the boy stilled with the particular instantaneous obedience of a child who knew that particular tone. She turned from the counter and her eyes found Elijah, and something moved across her face, some quick rearrangement of surprise and then something warmer. "Mr. Shelby." "Mrs. Lockhart," he said. He looked at the boy. "He is very determined." "He is extremely determined," she agreed. "He has been that way since he was 2 days old." She looked at him with those level, warm brown eyes. "How is the Bede Ranch treating you?" "Well enough," he said. "The work suits me." "Mama," said Clara, who was indeed 7 and had the particular assessing gaze of an oldest child who had been paying close attention to the adult world for considerably longer than most 7-year-olds. She was looking at Elijah with open and unself-conscious curiosity. "Is this a friend of yours?" "We have met once," Marcella said with a note of careful honesty. "He is very tall," Clara observed. "I am," Elijah agreed. "My name is Elijah. What is yours?" "Clara Marie Lockhart," she said, with the gravity of a person who understood the full importance of a proper name. "I am 7. Thomas is 4. He cannot climb barrels yet." "He seems to be working on it," Elijah said. Clara considered this and then nodded as though he had said something quite sensible. Marcella was buying flour and salt and a small piece of calico fabric, and Elijah bought the things he had come for: coffee and dried beans and a new pair of work gloves. And when they left the store at the same time, it felt like the natural outcome of the visit rather than a contrivance. They stood on the wooden sidewalk in the pale October sun, the children between them, Thomas holding his mother's hand now and looking at the horses tied at the rail with the devoted fascination of a 4-year-old. "May I carry that for you?" Elijah said, nodding at the flour sack she was holding alongside her other packages. She looked at him with those measuring eyes again and then handed him the flour without ceremony. "Thank you," she said. He carried it to the small wagon she had parked at the end of the street, an old rig pulled by the mule he had noticed in the corral that first night. He set the flour in the wagon bed and helped her stow the other packages, and when he helped Clara up onto the seat, the girl thanked him with such precise and practiced courtesy that he almost laughed. "She sounds like a small adult," he said quietly to Marcella. "She has been running my household since April," Marcella said, equally quiet. "She earned the right." He thought about that on the ride back to the ranch. He thought about a 7-year-old girl who had stepped up to run a household because her father had died of fever on a Sunday, and a mother who sang her children safe at night, and a 4-year-old boy who was going to climb that barrel someday. You could see it in his face. He started finding reasons to come to town on Sundays. Not every Sunday. He was not trying to be obvious about it. Or perhaps he was being obvious and just choosing not to examine it too closely. But he found that the Lutheran church service, which ended at 10:30, gave him an excellent view of who was in the congregation that particular morning. And Marcella Lockhart and her 2 children came to services twice out of every 3 Sundays, and after the 3rd time they attended on the same morning. They had fallen into the natural habit of walking out together and standing in the autumn sunlight exchanging a few words while Thomas chased the leaves that blew across the churchyard and Clara discussed with intense seriousness the content of the sermon. "She has opinions about Scripture," Elijah told Pete Vargas one evening, describing the girl. "She is 7, Pete said. "Very strong opinions," Elijah said. "She believes that Jonah made some poor decisions that could have been avoided with better planning." Pete stared at him. "You are spending your Sundays discussing biblical navigation strategy with a 7-year-old. "I am spending my Sundays talking to her mother," Elijah said, with more honesty than he intended. Pete looked at him for a long moment and then went back to cleaning his boots. "The widow Lockhart," he said. "Yes. She is a good woman," Pete said. "Robert Lockhart was a decent man. She had a rough spring." "I know," Elijah said. "She does not need someone who is just passing through," Pete said, not unkindly, just plainly, the way a man who had been in a place long enough to know its people spoke about them. "I know that too," Elijah said. He lay awake that night thinking about it, in the narrow bunk in the ranch hand quarters, listening to Clem Vargas snore 2 bunks away. He had been passing through places for going on 10 years now. Not because he was restless exactly, or not only because of that, but because he had never found a place that made him want to stay with enough conviction to actually do it. He had thought more than once that he was simply the kind of man who moved, the way a river moved, not from any particular failure but just from the nature of the thing. He was not sure he believed that anymore. The first real conversation he had with Marcella, not pleasantries and observations about the weather and the children, but the kind of conversation where 2 people actually showed each other something real, happened on the 3rd Sunday of November, when the sky had turned the pale gray of old pewter, and the temperature had dropped sharply enough that their breath made small clouds in the air. Thomas had fallen asleep in the wagon on the way out of the churchyard, tucked under a wool blanket, and Clara was reading a primer she had brought along, and Marcella and Elijah were walking at the wagon's pace as it made its slow way to the edge of town where their paths would diverge, and she said, out of what seemed like nowhere, "Do you ever get lonely out here?" He thought about giving her the easy answer, the cowboy answer, which was something along the lines of a man gets used to his own company. He thought about it and then set it aside. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded, looking ahead at the pale road. "I thought so," she said. "You have a look sometimes." "What kind of look?" "Like a man who is very used to being outside of things," she said. "Not unhappy exactly, but used to standing slightly apart." He was quiet for a moment, genuinely taken back by the accuracy of it. "That is a very precise observation," he said. "I am a precise person," she said, and there was a hint of warmth in the words. "When I have the energy for it." She looked sideways at him. "Do you have family anywhere?" "Not anymore," he said. "My parents are gone. I have no siblings. There is a cousin in Memphis I have not seen in 12 years who may or may not still be in Memphis." "Do you write to him?" "No," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a reproach, something more like gentle notification. "You should," she said. "You may be right," he said. "What keeps you moving?" she asked. She asked it without judgment, just honest curiosity, the way she asked most things, directly and with genuine interest in the answer. "Nothing particular," he said. "Or maybe nothing compelling enough to stop." He paused. "I have been stopping lately." She glanced at him. "You have been in Cutter's Creek less than 2 months. "It feels different," he said, and then felt immediately that he had perhaps said too much and looked straight ahead with the careful expression of a man checking to see how far out on the ice he had walked. But Marcella did not pull back from it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Robert used to say that the land here felt like it was trying to tell you something if you paid attention." "What was it telling him?" "That it wanted someone to stay," she said. "To put down roots in a place that is hard to root in. That the stubbornness required to live here is also the stubbornness that makes something worth keeping." They had reached the fork in the road. She stopped the mule and he stopped too, and they stood in the gray November morning with their breath clouding between them. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Thank you for letting me," he said. She gathered the reins. And then she said, with her eyes forward and a slight color in her cheeks that might have been the cold, "If you find yourself riding past my road next Sunday, there is usually coffee." She clucked at the mule and the wagon rolled away. And Elijah stood in the fork of the road with his hat in his hands, and the wind coming cold off the plains, and something singing in his chest that he had not heard in a very long time. He was at her porch the following Sunday at 2 in the afternoon with his hat in his hands, and a jar of honey he had traded a pair of work gloves for at the general store, because it seemed wrong to come with nothing and he was not quite sure yet of the right thing to bring. She opened the door with flour on her hands from baking and looked at the honey and then at him with an expression of genuine amusement. "Honey," she said. "I was not sure what else to bring," he said honestly. She laughed, full and genuine, and stepped back to let him in. The cabin was small and full of the smell of baking and the particular domestic warmth of a place that was lived in completely. Clara was at the table working on her letters with a slate and chalk. Thomas was on the braided rug near the hearth building something complicated with a set of wooden blocks. The fire was going, and the curtains were the calico she had bought at the store, sewn and hung since then, and the whole place had the feeling of a place that was making the best of what it had with considerable skill and care. He sat at the table while she finished her baking, and they talked through the partition of it. Him at the table with his coffee and her at the cook stove, and Clara drifted into the conversation occasionally with observations and questions. Thomas brought him a wooden block at one point and held it up with great seriousness, and Elijah took it with equal seriousness and examined it and handed it back, and Thomas returned to his construction satisfied. "He showed you the good one," Clara said, without looking up from her slate. "He does not show just anyone the good one." "I am honored," Elijah said. "You should be," she said. Marcella caught his eye over Clara's head, and the look they exchanged was warm and amused, and something beyond that, something that acknowledged a shared understanding of the extraordinary character of a 7-year-old who had decided, apparently, that Elijah Shelby was worth the good block. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. December arrived and the panhandle cold settled in properly, the kind of cold that had teeth to it, and the visits moved fully inside and became longer and more settled. He would arrive at 2 and leave before dark, and they would talk through the long pale afternoons about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the children and the town and the land, about books they had read, which was a considerable topic because Marcella was a reader. She had a small shelf of books that she treated with the reverence some people reserved for china or silver, and she lent him a copy of David Copperfield that he read in 3 weeks, and returned with the kind of opinions about the ending that led to a 40-minute conversation in which neither of them entirely agreed and both of them thoroughly enjoyed the disagreement. He learned things about her in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by crossing it at different times in different lights. He learned that she had grown up in Kentucky, that she was the daughter of a schoolteacher and a cabinet maker, that she had met Robert Lockhart when she was 20, and he was 24, that they had come to Texas 2 years later full of the particular bright-eyed ambition of young people who have decided that a new place is also a new start. He learned that she had been teaching herself to play the fiddle before Robert died and had not touched it since. He learned that she made decisions quickly and stuck to them, that she was fiercely protective of her children and equally protective of her own independence, that she found humor in unexpected places and had the gift of making other people feel it too. He learned that she sang to the children every single night, had done so since Clara was an infant, would do so as long as they let her. "Where did you learn the songs?" He asked one Sunday in December when the fire was bright and the children were playing and the light outside had gone the deep blue of a winter late afternoon. She considered. "Some from my mother, some I made up as I went along." She looked at the fire. "When Clara was a baby and I was very tired and could not always remember a whole song all the way through, I would just make up whatever came to me. She did not know the difference. And now she knows every word of every song I have ever sung and will absolutely correct me if I get something wrong," Marcella said, with a look of fond exasperation toward the child in question. "I heard you," he said, "that night on the porch. I want you to know it was the most beautiful thing I have heard in a long time." She looked at him then, and the firelight was on her face and she was very still for a moment. "That is kind," she said. "It is true," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need filling. Christmas came to Cutter's Creek with a light snow, the first of the season, and Elijah spent it at Holly's Beads table with the ranch hands and Holly's widowed sister who came from Amarillo for the occasion. And it was a fine enough Christmas. There was food and a fire, and the decent company of people he had come to know and respect. But he thought about the cabin 4 miles west of town and what Christmas morning looked like there. And on the afternoon of Christmas Day, he rode out with a pair of carved wooden horses he had traded for at the general store, one for Clara and one for Thomas, because he had thought about what a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old would actually want and decided horses were a safe choice. Thomas's face, when he saw the carved horse, was everything. Clara examined hers with careful technical interest and then looked up at him and said, "Thank you, Mr. Shelby. The carving on the mane is very detailed." "I am glad you noticed," he said. Marcella opened the door for him with a look of warm surprise and then a look of mild exasperation that he suspected was directed more at herself than at him. "You should not have," she said. "It is Christmas," he said simply. She let him in and fed him leftover biscuits and apple preserves and coffee by the fire, and they watched the children play with their horses. And outside the snow fell soft and particular on the panhandle, and the whole world smelled of wood smoke and cold air. And Elijah felt something settle in him like the last piece of something fitting into its proper place. He rode back to the ranch in the dark with the snowflakes catching on his coat and something so full in his chest he could not have named it clearly. He tried to name it anyway, because he was a thorough kind of man. He tried words like warmth and comfort and familiarity. He tried the word home, and then he held that word for a while and looked at it carefully, because it was a significant word and he did not want to use it carelessly. He kept it. January was brutal, the cold descending with real purpose, and Elijah worried about the cabin and its woodpile in the way a man worries about something he has claimed in his heart, if not yet in any official capacity. He rode out on his free afternoon the second Saturday of January with an extra load of split wood in the wagon he borrowed from Holly's, and Marcella met him at the door with the particular expression of a woman who has strong feelings about independence, but also has 2 children to keep warm, and is therefore going to set those strong feelings aside for the immediate moment. "You did not need to do this," she said. "I had extra," he said, which was not entirely accurate but was close enough. She helped him stack it on the porch without further argument, and when they were done, she made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table while the children were napping, and the snow packed itself against the window and the fire crackled. And it was the first time they had ever been in the cabin without the children awake, and the quiet between them was different from any other quiet they had sat in, charged with a kind of awareness that both of them felt and neither quite addressed yet. "Elijah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr., and they both noticed it. "Marcella," he said. They looked at each other across the table in the winter light, and then she looked down at her coffee cup, and a very faint color came into her face that was not from the fire. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to take it in the spirit in which it is meant, which is honest and not dramatic." "All right," he said. "I value what we have built here these past months," she said, looking up at him steadily. "Whatever it is, I value it very much. And I need to tell you that because I am not very good at pretending I do not feel things, and I think we have reached the point where it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise." He held himself very still. "What is it you think we have reached?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and careful because he needed to hear her say it and he also needed not to push. "Something that matters to me," she said simply. "Something I did not expect and was not looking for, and that I am not entirely sure what to do with." "Marcella," he said, and leaned forward slightly across the table. "I have been sitting on this feeling since the night I heard you singing and did not have the sense to ride away. And I am not a man who is very practiced at saying what he feels, but I am going to try very hard right now." He set his coffee down. "I think I am in love with you. I think I have been working toward that conclusion for 3 months. I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and not just because of the singing, though the singing was where it started, but because of all the rest of it, the way you move through this world that tries to be too hard for a person, and you simply refuse to let it be. The way you are raising those children, the way you talk about books and argue about scripture, and offer coffee to strangers who have frightened you half to death." She was very still across the table. "I am not passing through any more," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of man who says things he does not mean, and I am not saying this lightly." She looked at him for a long time, and her eyes were bright, though nothing spilled over because she was Marcella and she was composed in the way that only people who have had to be composed can be. "I believe you," she said at last, very quietly. "And," he said, "and I feel the same way," she said. "I have been feeling the same way for quite a while now and trying very hard to be sensible about it." "What does sensible look like?" "Exactly like what I have been doing," she said, moving slowly and paying attention. "And now?" She looked at him with those level brown eyes, and something in them opened, like a door on a warm room. "And now I think I have paid quite enough attention," she said, "and I know what I see." He reached across the table, and she let him take her hand, and they sat like that in the winter quiet with the children sleeping and the snow outside and the fire crackling. And it was not a dramatic moment, not a sweep of grand gesture, but it was real and certain in the way that the best things are real and certain, grounded in actual knowledge of an actual person. That was the beginning of it. If the night on the porch had been the start of the road, this was where the road became something a person actually walked forward on with intention. He came on Sundays and sometimes Saturdays, and the children became accustomed to him. Thomas in the way of a 4-year-old who simply incorporates new things into his world without ceremony. Clara in the more deliberate way of a girl who was watching and deciding. He took the time with Clara that she required. He did not push or perform. He played checkers with her and lost about half the time, which was not strategy but genuine fact because she was a very good checkers player. He read to Thomas from the child's primers in the evenings when Marcella was cooking, and Thomas would sit in the crook of his arm and point at pictures with one demanding finger, and Elijah would name whatever was pointed at with complete seriousness. There was an evening in February when Clara, out of nowhere, while they were all at the supper table together, looked up from her beans and said, "My papa used to sit in that chair." Everything went quiet. Elijah held himself carefully and did not move or speak, giving the moment all the room it needed. "I know," Marcella said gently to her daughter. "Do you think he would mind?" Clara asked. She was looking at Elijah now with those serious dark eyes, and the question was precise and direct and deserved a precise and direct answer. "I think," Elijah said slowly, "that your papa sounds like a man who cared very much about your mama and about you and Thomas, and that what a man like that wants most is for the people he loves to be safe and cared for and happy. I cannot speak for him, but I believe that is true." Clara considered this for a long moment. Then she picked up her fork and went back to her beans. "Mama is happier now than she was last summer," she said, as though this settled the philosophical question entirely. "Clara," Marcella said softly, and her voice had a quality that Elijah recognized as the sound of someone holding something very carefully. "It is true," Clara said simply. "It is true," Elijah agreed, and caught Marcella's eye across the table, and the look between them held everything that needed to be said. Spring came to the Panhandle with that particular wildness of a Texas spring, the sky going every color in a single afternoon, thunderstorms rolling in fast and fierce from the west, and the land responding with the extravagant green urgency of a season that knew it would not last long before the heat arrived. Elijah spent those months thinking forward in a way he had not thought forward in years, not just through the week or through the season, but into the next year and the one after. He spoke to Holly's bead on a Thursday morning in March, catching the rancher at the corral before the day's work began. He told Hollies that he intended to stay in Cutter's Creek for the long term if Hollies would have him in a more permanent capacity, and that there were circumstances in his personal life that were moving in a direction that made this a matter of some importance to him. Hollies, who was not a sentimental man but was a practical one, and had recognized early on that Elijah was the best ranch hand he had hired in 15 years, shook his hand without excessive ceremony and told him they would talk terms on Friday. The terms were fair. The work was real. The future was taking a shape Elijah could actually inhabit. He rode to the Lockhart cabin that Sunday with the spring air warm and the wildflowers beginning their brief bright run across the prairie, and he brought nothing with him except himself and what he intended to say. Marcella was in the garden when he arrived, turning the soil for spring planting with her sleeves rolled and her hands already dark with good earth. She looked up when she heard Copper and shaded her eyes with one dirt-dark hand and smiled, and that smile, that particular smile that she gave him that was not the same as the smile she gave anyone else, was enough to make him certain all over again. He got down from Copper and walked to the garden fence and leaned on it. "Can you take a minute?" he said. She read something in his face and set the hoe carefully against the fence and came to stand on the other side of it from him, and the fence between them was low enough that it was barely a gesture toward any kind of barrier. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You look very serious," she said. "I am very serious," he said. "I have been thinking about this for a long time and I want to say it right." He looked at her steadily, this woman in her garden with earth on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins, and her clear, warm eyes that had seen him accurately from the very beginning and chosen to trust what they saw. "I want to be here, Marcella, not just on Sundays, all of it. For the long run. I want to marry you if you will have me, and I want to be a proper presence in your children's lives, not a replacement for their father. He was their father and nothing changes that, but someone who is here. I have spoken to Hollies about staying on permanently, and I have meant to do this properly, so that is what I am trying to do." She looked at him for a long moment, and the wind moved through the new spring grass around the cabin, and somewhere Thomas could be heard inside at some activity that involved a considerable amount of enthusiasm and crashing. "You spoke to Hollies," she said. "I did, before asking me." "I thought the practical piece should be certain before I made any declarations," he said. "I did not want to declare myself and then have nothing solid to back it up with." "That is very thorough of you," she said. "I am a thorough person." "I know," she said. And then she reached across the low fence and took hold of the front of his shirt with one garden-dirty hand and said, "Yes, Elijah. Of course the answer is yes." He covered her hand with his and leaned forward over the fence and kissed her, and the sun was warm on both of them, and the spring wind was full of wildflower smell, and inside the cabin Thomas crashed into something else entirely. They told the children that afternoon. Thomas received the news with the sunny interest of a 4-year-old and immediately asked if Elijah's horse would live at their house now, which was taken as a positive response. Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at her mother and then at Elijah with those assessing eyes, and she said, "Will you be fair?" "I will always be fair," Elijah said without hesitation. "Will you stay?" "I will stay," he said. "That is my promise to you, Clara. Whatever happens, I will stay." She looked at him for another long moment, measuring the promise against the man making it with the extraordinary precision of a 7-year-old, who had learned early what it cost when people went away. And then she nodded once, a small serious nod, and said, "All right then. All right then." It was, Elijah thought, about the finest thing he had ever been told. They were married in June in the small Lutheran church in Cutter's Creek, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the deep certain blue of a Texas summer, and the heat had not yet risen to its true afternoon brutality. Marcella wore a dress of ivory muslin that she had made herself over the course of several weeks, quiet evenings of sewing while the children slept, and Elijah sometimes sat on the porch steps, because even now, even as a regular presence, she occasionally needed the quiet of those late evenings to herself, and he respected that completely. The dress was beautiful in its simplicity, with small buttons down the front and a collar of eyelet that she had traded mending for at the dry goods store. She carried wildflowers that Clara had gathered that morning with the earnest devotion of a small person who understood that flowers at a wedding were important, and had therefore collected approximately 4 times as many as were needed. Thomas wore a new shirt that Elijah had commissioned from the seamstress in town, because it seemed important that the boy have something new for the occasion, and Thomas had worn the shirt with the pride of someone who understood that he was at the center of something significant, though he was not entirely clear on the specific significance. Pete and Clem Vargas attended, and Holly's Bede, and 2 women from the church who had been Marcella's nearest friends in Cutter's Creek, a soft-spoken woman named Agnes Whitmore who ran the boarding house, and a brisk, cheerful woman named Dottie Crane, whose husband ran the livery stable. The Reverend performed the ceremony with the kind of thoughtful warmth that made it feel like the occasion it was, and when Elijah said the words "I do," they came from the full center of him. No hesitation, no reservation, just the plain, honest declaration of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. When he put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had saved 3 months of wages for, Marcella looked up at him with an expression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. That particular combination of joy and certainty, and something beyond that, the look of a person who has made a real and considered choice, and is completely at peace with it. They kissed, and Clara made a face, and Thomas made absolutely no face, because he had been watching Copper through the church window for the last several minutes, and was not paying full attention. The first year of marriage was the year Elijah understood what it meant to actually build something. The physical reality of it was immediate and satisfying. He moved into the cabin formally, and they reorganized it to accommodate him properly, adding a second room that he framed and built over the course of the summer with help from Pete Vargas and Clem, who were both skilled with timber. The room was intended to be for the children, to give Elijah and Marcella something resembling actual privacy, and when it was finished, Clara inspected every corner of it with her usual thoroughness, and declared it acceptable with the note that the window would benefit from curtains, which Marcella provided within 2 weeks. He tended the goats and expanded the small garden and repaired the corral and the fence line and brought the whole homestead into a condition that reflected actual ongoing investment rather than the managed holding pattern it had been in since Robert died. He also worked his days at the Bede Ranch, leaving before dawn and returning in the evenings, and the rhythm of it suited him, the work and the return, the thing you went out to and the thing you came back to. Coming back was the new thing, the best thing. He would ride up to the cabin in the dusk, and there would be light in the windows and the smell of supper and the sound of voices inside. And sometimes he could hear Marcella talking to the children, and sometimes he could hear Clara reading aloud for Thomas's benefit. And sometimes, when it was close to the children's bedtime, he would hear Marcella beginning to sing, and he would sit on the porch steps for a few minutes and listen before going inside, not because he was excluded from it, but because it was his. The particular private pleasure of a man who knew what he had found, and was not taking a single moment of it for granted. One evening in August, he sat on those steps and listened to her sing through the wall of their own house, the voice that had stopped him on a cold road 11 months ago, and he felt something so full and settled in his chest that he put his face in his hands for a moment just to contain it. Then he went inside. She looked up from the children's doorway with a warm smile, her finger to her lips, and he nodded and went to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee and waited for her. And when she came out of the children's room and pulled their door almost but not quite closed, She found him sitting at the table looking at her with an expression she had come to know, that particular quality of attention he gave her that was different from every other kind of attention she had ever been given. "What?" she said softly, sitting across from him. "Nothing," he said. "I just love you very much." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I love you very much too," she said. They sat like that in the lamplight while the children slept, and the summer night settled warm around the cabin, and it was quiet and complete and entirely real. They had their first argument in September, a proper one about money, specifically about whether they could afford to add a third goat to the corral, which Elijah thought they could and Marcella thought they could not, and which was actually not about the goat at all, but about the larger question of who made what decisions about what, which was a genuine and important question between two people who were each accustomed to making their own decisions. The argument lasted 2 days in the form of a charged and careful conversation, and was resolved when they sat down at the table with the actual accounts and worked through the numbers together, and decided collectively that the goat could wait until spring. And then Elijah said he should have asked before deciding, and Marcella said she should have led with the actual numbers rather than the conclusion. And they shook hands on it with mock formality that made them both laugh. And then it was behind them and better for having been had. "We will argue again," she said. "We will," he agreed. "I expect we will argue with some regularity. Are you worried about that?" "No," he said. "I think it means we are both actually present in this." She considered that. "That is a surprisingly philosophical observation." "I have my moments," he said. The autumn of their first married year was the autumn Elijah went with Holly's Bede and Pete Vargas on a 2-week cattle drive to a stockyard in Abilene, which was a necessary piece of the ranch's income and which Elijah had committed to before the wedding. Marcella sent him off with a packed saddlebag, and a look that she was managing very carefully, and a kiss that she let be brief, because she knew, if she let it be long, she would manage the look less well. He missed her every single day of those 2 weeks in a way that was nothing like any loneliness he had felt before. The previous loneliness had been formless, an ambient condition of his life. This loneliness had a precise shape and a name and 2 children, and a voice that sang in the evening, and it was in some ways harder to carry and in other ways much easier, because you could set your compass by it. He came back on a Tuesday afternoon, earlier than expected because the drive had gone well and the trail boss had pushed the pace, and Marcella was in the garden when he rode up, and she dropped her hoe and came through the gate with an urgency that she did not bother to moderate. And when he got down from Copper, she was already there, and he held her for a long time in the October afternoon with his face in her hair. 2 weeks is too long," she said into his shoulder. 2 weeks is too long," he agreed completely. Thomas emerged from the cabin at a full run and threw himself at Elijah's legs, and Clara came behind him at a more measured pace, but with her face bright in a way that she was not quite bothering to conceal. And Elijah crouched down and got both of them at once, and the 4 of them stood there in the garden in the October sun, and it was the fullest moment of his life up to that point. Winter came again, and it was different from the previous winter in every way that mattered. They were inside it together now properly, and the cabin was warmer for it in every sense. He read to the children in the evenings. He helped Clara with her letters and her arithmetic, and she progressed with the determination of someone who has decided that knowing things is a priority. He played with Thomas on the rug and taught him the names of animals and the sounds they made, and the game of trying to walk across the room without stepping on any of the scattered wooden blocks, which Thomas had never once successfully navigated. Marcella taught him to play the fiddle. He had found the fiddle one afternoon on its shelf and asked about it, and she had told him the story of leaving it alone since Robert died, and he had said gently that he thought Robert would probably not want it to stay silent, which was the kind of thing he only said when he was very sure of the ground and very sure of her, and she had looked at the fiddle for a long moment and then taken it down. She was not the most accomplished player. She was self-taught and intermittent and honest about both, but she played with genuine feeling, and the music filled the cabin in a way that made the children stop whatever they were doing and just listen. And Elijah would listen too, and the sound of her playing in the lamplight was one of those things he cataloged in the private record of his life as something he would not trade for anything. She tried to teach him. He was not a natural. The sounds he produced in the first several attempts were enough to make the goats uneasy, which he could tell because they made complaint noises from the corral, and Clara reported this information with her characteristic directness, and he took it in the spirit of fair feedback. "I am better with horses than fiddles," he said. "That is becoming apparent," Marcella said, pressing her lips together against a smile. "I respect my limits," he said. "I respect them too," she said. "Very much." February of 1875 was when Marcella told him she was expecting their child. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he left for the ranch, standing at the stove with a directness that was so entirely characteristic of her that he almost missed the magnitude of what she was saying. And then the magnitude arrived and he set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said. "The midwife confirmed it yesterday." He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands, and she looked up at him with those clear brown eyes that were warm and certain and slightly amused by his expression, which must have been something to see. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very all right," she said. "Are you?" "I am the best I have ever been," he said, which was completely accurate. He kissed her and went to work and spent the entire day at the ranch in a state of slightly elevated focus that Pete Vargas noticed and commented on, and Elijah told him, and Pete shook his hand and then went back to work in the unceremonious way that was Pete's natural register for all things. Clara, when informed, said, "I expected this would happen eventually," with the breezy authority of someone who has been paying close attention to cause and effect. Thomas said, "Will the baby like horses?" and was told possibly and found this satisfactory. The pregnancy was a healthy one, though the Texas summer heat was unkind to it, and Marcella moved through those months with the particular determined grace of a woman who does not allow physical difficulty to alter her essential character. She was tired in the early months and uncomfortable in the later ones, and she complained very little about either, which was not because she was performing stoicism, but because she was genuinely more interested in what was happening than in being miserable about it. Elijah did not entirely know how to help her through it, not having been present for the first two, but he learned what she needed and what she did not need, and he held the difference with care. He learned that she did not want to be treated as fragile. She found it condescending, but that she did appreciate the very specific help of him taking the heavier garden work without her having to ask, and making sure the woodpile was always full, and being there in the night when she could not sleep and simply needed someone to be awake with her. Those nights, the wakeful ones in the Texas dark, became some of his most treasured memories of that time. She would sit up in the small hours and he would sit up with her, and they would talk very quietly so as not to wake the children, about anything and everything, the same way they had talked through long winter afternoons before they were married, only easier now, more settled. The talk of two people who have chosen each other thoroughly and are continually interested in the discovery that the choice keeps being confirmed. She told him things in those quiet hours that she might not have said in daylight, things about Robert and about grief, and about the strange doubled feeling of loving someone new without losing the love that had been there before. How both things could be true at once. How she had been afraid at first that loving Elijah diminished what she had before, and had learned that it did not work that way at all. That love was not a finite quantity that got divided smaller with each addition, but something that grew with use like a muscle. He told her things too. About his father and the drinking that came after his mother died, and the helplessness of watching a person disappear into themselves, and not being able to stop it. About leaving Tennessee at 17, with the determination that he was not going to let grief do that to him, and the irony of discovering that the way he had prevented it was by not letting himself have enough to grieve, never staying, never rooting, never being truly present anywhere. "Until you sat on my porch," she said. "Until I sat on your porch," he agreed. "The singing did that," she said with a small teasing quality. "The singing stopped me," he said. "You did the rest." She leaned her head on his shoulder in the dark, and his arm went around her, and they sat like that until she was sleepy enough to lie back down. And he would lie next to her and listen to her breathe until he knew she was truly sleeping. And then he would sleep too, easy and certain. Their son was born on the 1st of October, 1875, in the early morning, with the midwife Agnes Whitmore in attendance and Elijah in the kitchen, because he had been very firmly directed to the kitchen, which he accepted without argument because this was Marcella's domain in every sense, and he knew when to stay out of someone's way. He sat at the kitchen table and listened to the sounds from the bedroom and tried to remember to breathe normally. Clara sat across from him with a book open in front of her that she was not reading. Thomas was asleep on the rug. When the baby cried, the sound of it went through Elijah like a current. Agnes opened the bedroom door 20 minutes later and looked at him with a pleased and tired expression and said, "A boy, Mr. Shelby. Both of them are doing well." He went in and there was Marcella, tired and extraordinary, with a small bundled person in her arms who was red-faced and new and absolutely certain of his own importance in the way of all newborns. She looked up at Elijah with an expression of such complete exhaustion and joy combined that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Come meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the careful, terrified reverence of a man who has never held anything so important, and the baby squinted up at him with the skeptical look of someone who has very recently arrived from a journey and is still forming opinions about the destination. "Hello," Elijah said to him, very quietly. "I have been waiting for you." They named him James Robert Shelby, the Robert for the man who had been here before and whose children Elijah was raising with the full weight of that responsibility and the full gladness of it. Clara, when she was brought in to see the baby, looked at him with scientific interest and said he was smaller than she had expected. Thomas looked at the baby for a long time and then looked at Elijah and said, "He cannot ride a horse yet." "He will need a bit of time," Elijah agreed. "How much time?" "A few years." Thomas accepted this timeline and went back to his blocks. James was a calm baby, calmer than his mother's description of either Thomas or Clara as infants had led Elijah to expect, and he slept in good stretches and woke with more interest than complaint. And in the evenings when Marcella sat in the rocking chair by the fire and nursed him and sang, Elijah would sit across from her with Clara reading beside him and Thomas in the middle of some floor-level project, and the cabin was full of lamplight and life and the sound of her voice. And it seemed to him impossible that a year and a half ago he had been a man who sat on a stranger's porch in the dark listening to something he could not name and could not leave. He understood it now. He had understood it for a while. He had been hearing the sound of his own life before he knew what it looked like. The years that followed were full in the way that genuinely good lives are full, not without difficulty or sorrow or the ordinary grinding friction of real existence, but full the way a table set for people who love each other is full, the way a field that has been properly tended is full, with the evidence of real effort and real return. Clara grew into a young woman of remarkable intelligence and strong opinions, and a gift for teaching that expressed itself first in the relentless education of her younger brothers, and then, when she was 17, in the serious intention to attend the new school in Amarillo that trained teachers. And Elijah and Marcella supported this ambition with the complete conviction of two people who recognized real vocation when they saw it. Thomas became, as the carved horse and the barrel climbing had suggested he would, a horseman of genuine talent and a person of energetic humor and fierce loyalty, who at 12 years old had already established himself as the best young rider in the county. a distinction he wore with a modesty that was almost certainly attributable to his mother's influence. James Robert grew into the calm assurance of his early weeks, a child who watched the world with steady brown eyes that were entirely his mother's, and who had his father's quality of attending completely to whatever was in front of him, and who at 4 could already name every horse on the Bede Ranch and the particular personality of each. In the fall of 1879, Hollis Bede, whose health had been declining for 2 years with the slow certainty of a man who has worked his body without rest for 50 years, sat down with Elijah and made him an offer that changed the shape of everything going forward. He wanted to sell Elijah half the ranch. Not give it, not bequeath it to some distant relation who would not know what to do with it, but sell it, at a fair price, paid over time in the way that working people in the West structured these things when they were serious about them. The other half would pass to Hollis's nephew in Amarillo when the time came, a young man named Franklin who had visited the ranch twice and had the sensible intentions and the physical capacity for the work if not yet the experience. Elijah went home and sat with Marcella at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and laid it all out, the terms and the timeline and what it would mean, and she listened to all of it with her hands folded on the table and her eyes clear and attentive. "What do you want?" she asked when he had finished. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have been building toward this for 6 years without perhaps fully knowing it, and that this is what staying looks like when it finishes arriving." He looked at her across the table. "Is that a yes?" "It is a yes," she said. "It is an absolutely certain yes." He shook Hollis Bede's hand the next morning and signed the papers that the lawyer in town drew up, and became, at 34 years old, half owner of the Elijah Shelby Ranch, which was renamed accordingly, and which he would spend the next 20 years building into something genuinely worth the name. There were hard things in those years, because hard things are the price of a real life. The drought of 1880 was brutal and cost them a quarter of the herd and a full season's earnings, and required the kind of patient endurance that tests what a partnership is actually made of. It was made of enough. They got through it by making careful decisions together and not spending energy on panic that was needed for actual work, and on the other side of it the ranch was leaner and tighter, and in some ways better for the discipline the hard year had required. Hollis Bede died in the spring of 1881, quietly and with reasonable dignity, which was what he had wanted. Elijah sat with him in his last days and read to him from the almanac, which was what Hollis wanted read, and was with him at the end, which felt like the right and proper thing. He buried the old man in the Cutter's Creek Cemetery and planted a marker that said what needed to be said, and then he went home, and Marcella held him in the kitchen in the quiet after the children were sleeping and did not say anything at all, because she knew when words were not what was needed. Franklin Bede arrived that summer, a young man of 23 with Hollis's stubborn jaw and none of Hollis's bad temper, which was a good combination. Elijah worked with him with the same patient thoroughness that he brought to training horses, and Franklin had the good sense to learn from someone who knew more than he did, and within a year they were partners in the practical sense as well as the legal one. Clara left for Amarillo in the fall of 1882, 18 years old and impossibly capable, with a trunk full of her mother's careful mending, and a letter of introduction from the Reverend of the Lutheran Church, and Elijah's absolute conviction that the town of wherever she eventually landed was going to benefit enormously from her presence. Marcella stood in the yard and watched the stage until it was gone from sight, and Elijah stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and they were quiet together for a while with the particular quiet of parents who have done their job and are sending the evidence of it into the world. "She is going to be extraordinary," Elijah said. "She already is extraordinary," Marcella said. "That is why it is hard." He held her tighter. Thomas went to work on the ranch full-time at 17, which surprised no one including Thomas, who had been doing substantial ranch work since he was 12, and was now one of the best hands on the operation, a fact he handled with the same steady good humor that characterized most of what he did. James Robert, at 7, had recently announced with complete seriousness his intention to become a veterinarian, based on his ongoing study of every animal on the property. And while Elijah had no immediate expectation of being able to fulfill this ambition for the boy, he also did not dismiss it, because he had learned from Marcella that the right response to a real vocation was not to manage its expectations, but to take it seriously and see what became possible. It was in the spring of 1883 that Marcella told him she was expecting again, with the same directness she had used 9 years ago, standing at the stove with the morning light coming through the new curtains that replaced the oilcloth, the windows being properly glazed now, the house considerably larger than it had been, the second addition having been built 3 years ago with Thomas and Franklin Bede's help, and a great deal of argument about the angle of the roof. Again, he said, and immediately felt the inadequacy of the word. She looked at him over her shoulder with her eyebrows raised. "I mean," he said, "that is wonderful. That is completely wonderful." "That is better," she said. "I was startled," he said. "I am not startled anymore. I am delighted." "You are scrambling," she said. "I am delighted while scrambling," he said. She laughed, the same laugh he had first heard through a cabin wall 10 years ago, warm and full and entirely real, and he crossed the kitchen and kissed her on the temple while she stirred the morning's porridge and thought that 10 years had done absolutely nothing to reduce the degree to which that sound made everything right. Their daughter arrived in November of 1883, on a Thursday evening with the first proper winter storm of the year coming in from the north, and she was healthy and loud, and arrived with the kind of decisive energy that suggested strong opinions in her future. James Robert, who had been waiting with Elijah in the kitchen in a state of intense, focused calm that was very characteristic of him, heard the baby cry and looked up at his father with bright, serious eyes. "A boy," he said. "We will see," Elijah said. Agnes Whitmore, still the midwife of Cutter's Creek at 61 and showing no signs of retiring, came to the door and told them it was a girl, and James Robert considered this information for a moment and then said, "Does she know about horses yet?" "She will," Elijah said. "We have time." They named her Ruth Elijah Shelby, and she was from the first moment a person of absolute certainty about what she wanted and what she thought and who she was, which was going to make for a very interesting childhood, and which Elijah looked at with the same combination of pride and productive wariness that Marcella's father must have felt raising Marcella. He told Marcella this, and she said, "That is either a compliment or a warning." "Both," he said. "Fair," she said. He was 38 years old, and his wife was 35, and their children were Clara, who was teaching school in Amarillo and writing letters home every 2 weeks that were detailed and entertaining, and full of observations about her students that sounded exactly like Clara, and Thomas, who was 20 at the ranch, and growing into a man of real substance, and James Robert, who was 8 and methodical and brilliant with animals, and Ruth Eliza, who was new to the world, and apparently intended to make her presence known in it. He was also, as of this year, a man who owned a working ranch in the Texas Panhandle, who had a real house with glazed windows and a good roof, who knew his neighbors and was known by them, who went to church on Sundays and argued about the almanac with Franklin Bede, and sat at a table set for people he loved every evening of his life. He was a man who had stayed. On a November evening, with the new baby sleeping and James Robert in bed and Thomas in the bunkhouse with the other hands, Elijah sat on the porch in the cold dark the way he had sat on a different porch 11 years ago, because the habit of it had never entirely left him, the pleasure of sitting outside in the night air and listening to the world. The stars were the same stars, that extravagant, careless scatter of light across the black sky. The air smelled the same, dry grass and distance, and a faint trace of wood smoke from the chimney. The door opened behind him and Marcella came out with a shawl around her shoulders and 2 cups of coffee, and she sat beside him on the bench he had built and put there 2 years ago specifically because they liked to sit on the porch in the evenings. And she handed him a cup and tucked herself against his side, and he put his arm around her and they sat together in the dark. "Cold," she said. "Cold," he agreed. "Come here." She shifted closer and he held her warmer, and the night pressed close and peaceful around them. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time you brought me coffee on a porch?" "I had a skillet," she said. "You had a skillet," he confirmed. "I was very glad you decided against using it," she laughed. "You were the most astonishing thing, this man sitting on my porch in the middle of the night looking entirely embarrassed and entirely unwilling to leave." "I was not unwilling to leave," he said. "I was unable to leave. There is a difference." "The singing," she said. "The singing," he said. She was quiet for a moment, warm against his side, looking at the stars. "I will never stop, you know," she said, "even when they are all too old for it." "I know," he said. "I would not want you to. Do you still listen?" she asked. "From out here, every single time," he said. "Every single time I come home and you are singing, I sit on these steps for a few minutes and just listen before I come in." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I knew that," she said. "I could always hear Copper stop. You never said anything. I liked knowing you were out there," she said. Listening, she settled her head back against his shoulder. "It always made me feel held." He pressed his lips to her hair. "You are held," he said quietly. "You have been held for 11 years. You will be held for the rest of my life." The wind moved through the mesquite at the edge of the yard, a sound like the slow turning of the world. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent pattern that meant something, Elijah thought, not in spite of the indifference but because of it, because they did not care, and yet there they were, burning and present, and down here below them, on this porch. Two people were holding each other in the dark, and that was care. That was the whole of it. Ruth Eliza cried from inside the house, the clear small sound of an infant requiring something. And Marcella moved to rise, and Elijah rose with her, and they went inside together, into the light and warmth of their home, and she went to the baby and he stoked the fire. And Thomas's laugh could be heard faintly from the bunkhouse in a break in the wind, and somewhere in the East Clara was writing a letter by lamplight, and James Robert was sleeping the deep sleep of a child who had spent the day at his proper work. And Ruth Eliza quieted in her mother's arms as Marcella began to sing. Elijah stood by the fire and listened. He could hear her through the wall of the bedroom, the low, certain voice moving like water over smooth stone, the song she had made up as she went along so many years ago, the one about the meadow and the bright silver river and the child sleeping safe and the stars knowing every name. The same song, or a version of it, adjusted and accumulated over the years, carrying new verses and old ones together the way a river carries everything it has passed through. He leaned his shoulder against the wall and closed his eyes and let the sound of it move through him the way it always moved through him, that particular sweetness that had nothing to do with prettiness and everything to do with truth, the truth of someone who loved something enough to sing to it every night without fail, who believed that a voice in the dark was a real and sufficient protection against the fears that came in the dark. He had believed it the first night he heard it. He believed it more now. He stayed there until the song finished and the baby was settled, and Marcella came through the bedroom door and found him leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. "Were you listening again?" she said. "I was listening," he said. He opened his eyes and looked at her in the firelight, this woman he had found on a cold autumn road in 1873, this woman who had offered him coffee and wariness, and then, slowly and with complete intention, herself. "I will always listen." She came to him and he put his arms around her and she put her face against his chest, and they stood in the warm room with the fire at their backs and the night outside and the whole of their life surrounding them on every side. "I am so glad," she said, muffled against his shirt, "that you did not just ride on." "So am I," he said. "So am I." Outside, the Panhandle stars burned on in their vast, indifferent abundance, and the wind moved through the mesquite, and the ranch was quiet, and the children were safe, and the song was done for the night, and the man who had heard it through a cabin wall and stayed was still here, still staying, would keep staying, in the way of a river that has finally found the valley it was made to run through, easy and certain and going nowhere at all.